After creating this animation in the last video, I've decided to do something simpler this time. Something more like an animated illustration where only a few parts of the picture are moving. The reason is pretty simple. It's just easier to make the animation this way because it doesn't require you to animate the whole character, which can save you a lot of time. I've decided to only animate the cat's eyes and tail, which will be hand-drawn animated, and I also want to add some movement to the flowers, but I would do the animation in Adobe After Effects as cutout animation. It just doesn't make sense to make it as a hand-drawn animation because the outcome wouldn't be too different, as the movement is very simple and the hand-drawn animation would take so much longer to create. It's usually a good idea to think about the animation in the early stages of the illustration, as you can adjust the process for it and you can separate everything into designated layers. So you wouldn't end up with the cat and flowers being on the same layer as the background, for example, which would make it hard to work with, and at some point you would have to separate the layers anyway. When I finish the illustration, I've created layer comps to make the export a bit easier. After that, I imported the project into Adobe After Effects, where I made a test animation of the flowers, just to be sure that everything works as it's supposed to. I wanted to add a subtle movement to the flowers, like gently swaying from side to side, so I adjusted all the anchor points to the bottom of the stems of the flowers, as this is the place from which the movement will originate. At first, I used position and rotation keyframes to make the flowers sway, but the movement didn't look right. It was too stiff, so I used Puppet tool to add a bit of bending to the stem of the flower. It took some tweaking in Graph Editor to make the movement look more natural, but overall the animation of the flowers started to look quite okay at this point, so I decided to move on to the cat. For the hand-drawn animation, I'm using TVPaint Animation software, but there are plenty of alternatives like Krita, Blender or OpenToons, which are for free. And as for the paint options, which are still cheaper than TVPaint, there are Clip Studio Paint X version and Procreate Dreams. If you are a beginner, I would probably recommend starting with Krita, as it's fairly easy and intuitive to use for a hand-drawn animation. Also, for this animation I chose a bit different approach than in the previous one. In the previous video I mostly used pose-to-pose method to animate the cat, but here I mainly used a straight-ahead approach. Animating straight ahead means that you draw the first frame, then the second one and the third one until you finish the sequence, as opposed to the pose-to-pose method, which is more controlled approach where you start with keyframes and breakdowns and then you fill the remaining space with in-betweens. Usually the approach you choose depends on the object you are animating. Like the straight ahead is great for animating elements or, the cat's tail or things that are spontaneous and a bit unpredictable. And the pose-to-pose approach is more suitable for controlled movement, but you can always combine these two approaches together. When I was happy with the animation, I exported the drawings into Photoshop and started coloring them. I also colored 5 drawings of the cat's body so I could create a looping animation of it. The reason for it is the loose watercolor style I use for the cat. The brush texture creates a jitter effect, and there would be quite noticeable difference between the cat's static body and the moving tail. The coloring is a lengthy and somewhat boring part of the animation, but I quite enjoy it as I can finally listen to some podcasts or music while I work, so I don't have to concentrate as much as I do when animating. I imported the colored frames from Photoshop back to TVPaint and put them on the timeline according to the timing of the rough animation. So I could finally see how the coloring looks like in the motion. There were some mistakes I noticed. I, for example, realized that I used the wrong color shade for the cat's tail, so I have to correct that. And I also noticed 2 other problems. First, I realized that I forgot to color one of the cat's paw at one frame, but I didn't want to go back to Photoshop, so I painted it TVPaint. And the second problem was that I haven't made a loop animation of the cat's eyes. I only animated the blinking, and I didn't like the otherwise static eyes. And I had the same problem with the mouth, so I colored that in TVPaint because I realized that it's easier than going back to Photoshop, and the brushes weren't that much different, so it's not noticeable in the final animation. Once again, I imported the colored animation into the Adobe After Effects, where I added a little wiggle to the cat's face to match the movement of its body. I also added a loop of redrawn frames of the end to bring it to life. I used time remapping and looping expression to do that, but for some reason it made double exposure at one frame and I couldn't figure out why it's happening. So I did it the old-fashioned way and just copied and pasted the frames on the timeline for the whole duration of the animation. And that's it.